Hey guys, Rob here with McDojoLife. In today's McDojo news, we're going to talk about how an Avon Lake martial arts instructor has been sentenced to 6 years for sexually assaulting a student. Let's check out the story. Erin Stephens was led out of a Lorain County Common Pleas court in handcuffs on Wednesday after being sentenced to 6 years in prison for sexually abusing a former student at her Avon Lake martial arts studio. A jury of 9 women and 3 men deliberated for less than 40 minutes Wednesday before finding Stephens, age 31 of Avon Lake, guilty of 3 counts of sexual battery for abusing the then 16-year-old at her former business, Avon Lake ATA Martial Arts, on Penn Oak Parkway. Judge Christopher Rothgary immediately pronounced the sentence, 2 years on each of the 3 counts, all to run consecutive to each other for a total of 6 years. He also labeled Stephens a Tier 3 sex offender, meaning she will be required to register with her local sheriff's office in person every 90 days for the rest of her life upon release from prison. Rothgary refused defense attorney Justin Weatherly's request to allow Stephens to remain free on bond and to schedule a sentencing hearing at a later date, saying that he had all the facts and evidence he needed to impose a sentence. Rothgary said Stephens used her position of trust to commit sexual abuse. Essentially, that's the crux of this case. Can people who look at a case like this say, I can feel comfortable leaving my kid with a coach, with a teacher, with a drama director, with a Boy Scout leader? Rothgary said. Can I walk away? Can I drop my kid off and say my kid's going to be all right? Can someone like the victim's mother trust that somebody who's been trained since they were 10 years old by a person, since they were a small child, a 10-year-old, can they be trusted? And even when they have a fleeting thought that they weren't worthy of that trust, they put it out of their mind because it's unimagined, he said. They feel bad and they have that thought. The letter of the law doesn't allow Stephens to argue that she was in love with her 16-year-old victim, quote, and desired his affection and kindness, Rothgary said. Stephens' defense revealed the double standard the judge said exists in similar sexual abuse cases. I suspect if I had a 59-year-old shop teacher and a 16-year-old girl that he taught, that it'd be pretty surprising if you tried to advance a defense of I was in love with this 16-year-old and I desired affection and kindness, and they were the one in charge. They were the one who manipulated everything. Stephens' admission that she committed a crime, quote, might be the first step towards remorse, Rothgary said, but it didn't go far enough. He said the defense trial strategy involved, quote, the most aggressive cross-examination of a child victim he's seen in 19 years on the bench. I'm not sure I've ever seen one treated that way, and to be honest with you, that shows a certain lack of remorse as well, Rothgary said. Stephens did not testify in her own defense Wednesday. She showed little emotional reaction throughout the 3-day trial, and none when she was given the chance to address the court following her conviction. It was never my intent to hurt the victim. It was never my intent to hurt anyone, Stephens said, talking about losing her business, losing a pregnancy, and not being able to be with her 2 young children. If I'm incarcerated, I understand. We have a judicial system for a reason, and that I'm sorry. I understand, but it is what it is, Stephens said. I never meant to harm the victim. I just wasn't thinking. Citing her Christian faith and that of her son, the victim's mother publicly forgave Stephens in court. Her son was not present for the sentencing. Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and he commands me to forgive, and the victim feels the same way, she said, also asking Rothgary for leniency for Stephens. The victim's mother said she and her son reported the abuse because Stephens' quote, lack of judgment with young people. The victim looked up to Erin as a mentor, a teacher, someone that her whole family cared about, and she betrayed that, the mother said. We just knew that because of the lack of judgment that was used, that we didn't feel she should be working with children. The victim wanted Stephens to have to register as a sex offender so she won't ever be allowed to work with children, his mother said. Having said that, I forgive you, Erin, the victim's mother said. Assistant Lorain County Prosecutor Daniela Lay said Stephens lied and blamed the victim, attempted to manipulate others to believe that he was the one who sought a relationship and showed no genuine remorse. It was all put on the victim, but that was shown not to be true, said Lay, who prosecuted Stephens as co-counsel with Assistant Prosecutor Patrick Hakos. Authorities said sexual abuse took place at both the studio in 2019 and later at Stephens' former apartment in Sheffield Lake during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The teen had been a student of hers since at least the age of 10. The abuse occurred mid-2019 and early 2020, according to testimony in court. Stephens never denied having sex with the student, even putting out a letter to the families at the studio after she was charged in July of 2022. In that letter, Stephens called herself the victim's, quote, instructor and, quote, a person of authority over him. Prosecutors used the letter against Stephens in court. In his closing arguments, Hakos told the jury all they had to decide was whether the sex was a criminal act because Ohio law is very clear on the matter. What Stephens did is a crime so long as she was not married to the victim, and that victim is a minor while Stephens was his athletic coach, instructor, or a person with temporary or occasional disciplinary control over the victim, Hakos said. Sexual abuse happened or it didn't, he said. Stephens' alleged romantic feelings for the victim doesn't matter, Hakos said. Stephens' defense labeled the alleged abuse, quote, a relationship. Weatherly and his co-counsel, Brandon Henderson, told the jury it was the 16-year-old victim who had all the control over Stephens, his 28-year-old Taekwondo instructor and a married mother of two, convincing the jury that Stephens was the victim's friend or co-worker rather than his instructor would have been vital to the defense. Even though the victim was 16, which is the age of consent for sexual activity in Ohio, state law prohibits sports coaches, instructors, or those in positions of authority from having sex with minors under their control on penalty of prosecution. Even then, there is ambiguity in the term instructor. Henderson told the jury in his closing argument, his client's relationship with the victim was more like a friendship or romantic relationship than a student and instructor relationship, he argued. Weatherly and Henderson argued that Stephens simply fell in love with the victim. She was unaware, her attorney said, of the subsection in Ohio's sexual battery law that made her, quote, relationship a felony. Weatherly also unsuccessfully lobbied Rothgary to dismiss the case following the guilty verdict, and to rule that Ohio's sexual battery statute was unconstitutional as it applied to his client because she did not take, quote, unconscionable advantage of the victim. Rothgary told the defense that on any questions of constitutionality, they would have to take it up with the Court of Appeals. Stephens taught the victim from 2014 to 2020 when he left her studio. The victim disclosed the sexual abuse to his wife, his mother, and Avon Lake Police in early 2022. Erin Stephens' husband, Kenny Stephens, was the lone witness to testify on her behalf. He said the victim and the other teen instructors were more like her friends and were taking advantage of her, not showing up to work or showing up late when they did. There was no hierarchy at the studio when Kenny Stephens first became an instructor there in mid-2020. It was chaos to say the least. No one was fully in charge, he testified. Kenny Stephens now runs the studio out of the same building used by his wife, teaching students ages 4 and older, he confirmed in court. Once they turn 16, is that when they become sexual objects? Assistant Prosecutor Lay asked Kenny Stephens during her cross-examination of him. That question drew a defense objection which Rothgary sustained. Erin Stephens is the 106th sex offender prosecuted in Lorain County since 2021, County Prosecutor J.D. Tomlinson said in a news release Wednesday, and she violated the trust placed in her as a coach and an instructor. Tomlinson thanked the jury, his assistant prosecutors, and the Avon Lake Police Department, and most importantly, this brave survivor, for all the work in holding Erin Stephens accountable. Time to unpack it. So this 10-year-old kid starts taking martial arts at this particular martial arts studio, and he does so for 6 years. And during that time, it seems that the instructor decides to start having a sexual relationship with him when he becomes 16. Which is around the same time that he leaves the studio. After he leaves, they both move on with life, he gets married, and then he has a breakdown moment where he confides in people around him about the abuse that happened. She does not deny this, and as a matter of fact, even put out a letter about what had happened. So everything seems to point very clearly towards sexual abuse, except for the strange law in Ohio that allows the age of consent to be 16. The problem in this case is the person who's older has a position of authority, so yet again, we're right back to it being sexual abuse. The strangest part about all this, which would be comical if it wasn't for the sexual abuse, is her defense attorneys tried to say that the 16-year-old child was manipulating the situation. I'm sure everyone in that courtroom rolled their eyes when they heard that crap. She's a business owner and an adult, and yet somehow the 16-year-old child was able to manipulate the situation? No. Another strange thing about the case is her now husband, who is now running that martial arts facility, was the only person to come to her defense. How old is he? How long were they together? Was the husband around while she was still sleeping with the 16-year-old? We don't know, but it seems strange. So now she's locked up, but we're left with an issue. Her husband, who's still running that martial arts studio today, condones the behavior. Not only condones it, defends it. His reasoning? Because it was disorganized? That's like his honest reasoning? I mean, when I read it, I laughed. I had to like re-record because of how astonishingly dumb that is. That's ridiculous. It's the dumbest shit I've ever heard in my life. Because it's unorganized, she has to sleep with a 16-year-old? No. And that person, that logic, is now in charge of teaching martial arts at that facility. I'm dumbfounded. It's like there was a turd in the punch bowl. And the person in charge of cleaning up the punch bowl poured all the punch bowl out, took the turd out, got a new bowl, filled it back up with new punch, and then he just pooped in the bowl himself. This is reality, people. This stuff is really happening. It just happened. That school is still open. That guy is in charge. That brings us to the question of the day. Do you feel there should be some standards put in place that should be required for someone before they open up a martial arts school? Maybe they should have background checks done. I don't know. That would be a good start. But anyway, I would like to know what your thoughts are about this particular case. Be sure to answer that question in the comment sections below before you say anything else, so that way I know that you watched the entire video. As always, I'm looking forward to reading your comments in the comment sections below. Thank you all for the likes, comments, shares, subscriptions, and obviously memberships. Keep the martial arts legit.
My baby got robbed the other day by degenerates. So she wanted to learn some new form of this self-defense. So she did her research and perused it online and found this dude said he could move shit with his mind. He called himself Seafood Paul Zimmerman. He got a dojo with a strip mall near Cinnabon. Now she spends all day trying to break boards with her thoughts, but the only thing she's breaking is my little life.